I'm having trouble understanding when cards count as being sent to the graveyard and when they don't count. Can you help me with that?
Sure, cards going to the graveyard can be a bit confusing, but I can explain the different ways that might happen.
Great, thank you.
Firstly, there's an odd rule most players aren't familiar with but is in the rulebook, but who reads the rulebook?
There's a rulebook.
Yup, when a card is returned to the graveyard from the banished zone, it is not considered to have been sent to the graveyard. This means it can play around restrictions like other than the turn this card was sent to the graveyard. So burial from a different dimension would allow you to use some cards immediately like Shuranui's Spectral Sword.
That's helpful to know.
Secondly, when a card is sent to the graveyard, it means it has made it to the graveyard from any place except being returned from the banished pile. That includes being sent, destroyed, tributed, or discarded or by a game mechanic. Cards can legally be activated that would send a card to the graveyard for an effect, such as Foolish Burial or the Phantom Knights of Rusty Bar Ditch, even if all cards are being banished instead currently, such as by Dimensional Fissure. It may not resolve correctly depending on the problem-solving card text. Bar Ditch has the then conjunction, so if the monster it sends to the graveyard was banished instead, the then conjunction won't allow us to set a Fog Blade, but you can use Foolish Burial without a problem. It will just send the monster to the banished pile instead.
Okay, that makes sense.
Thirdly, a card is considered to be sent to the graveyard by a card effect when it was not sent as a cost to activate a card. Costs are things that come before a semicolon, such as discarding DD, Crow, or a requirement for summoning such as for Black Luster Soldier Envoy of the beginning. Although an effect that would make a player take an action that sends the card to the graveyard is not considered to be sent by a card effect, such as by Herald of the Abyss.
I see, so the pendulum mechanic doesn't allow pendulums on the field to go to the graveyard as they go to the extra deck face up instead. Can I use cards that would send these cards to the graveyard?
Yes, for effect, but not for a cost. To be sent to the graveyard to activate a card or effect of a card specifically means to be sent as a cost. This is the type of condition written on all of the Atlantean monsters to be activated. It's not legal to activate a card that would send cards to the graveyard while Macrocosmos is active because those costs cannot be paid. So some cards with that cost cannot be activated in some scenarios, or if the cost was a pendulum monster even without Macrocosmos in play. This is because pendulums on the field would go to the extra deck instead and costs must be paid as they're written to activate a card. So Forbidden Droplet often cannot be used very well in the pendulum deck, and isn't very good versus Masked Hero Dark Law or Kashtira Arise Hard as both prevent you from paying costs that would send cards to the graveyard.
Okay, that's good to know.
Finally, to tribute a card means to send a monster that is face up or face down from your field to the graveyard by default, but it is not required and may be directed elsewhere by some card effects or the pendulum mechanic. You cannot tribute your opponent's monster to activate the Code Talker even if it points to their monster because tributes by default must be sent from your field. Some cards will also allow you to tribute cards from other places such as Necros of Valkyris which can tribute from hand. And others may also allow you to tribute spells or traps instead of monsters such as Masterpiece the True Draco Slaying King. Some even let you use your opponent's cards as the tribute, such as Rikakon, but these exceptions must be written on the card. Ritual Summoning also has an exception, which also lets you use monsters in your hand by default according to the rulebook. Tributed cards are not considered destroyed or discarded. They are still considered to be sent to the place they go, by effect or cost, depending on the situation.
Got it. So what about destroyed cards and discarded cards?
When a card is destroyed, it is sent to the graveyard by default, but it's not required to go there specifically and may be directed elsewhere by some card effects. Destroyed cards are not considered to have been tributed or discarded, but they are still considered to be sent to the place they go, by battle, effect, game mechanic, or cost, depending on the situation. Some cards still require themselves to be destroyed and sent to the graveyard such as Bayvice Rasors, and won't be able to trigger under Macrocosmos. Cards that are already in the graveyard or banished pile can't be destroyed, but cards anywhere else can. This has been relevant recently in Tier Limit as Rolkalos can negate cards that activate in the graveyard or banished pile but can't destroy them, in which case it won't do the then part of its effect by due to its then conjunction. Normally you can't activate a card whose effect you can't fully resolve at the point of activation. It seems to be an official ruling that allows any card that negates activations to also be used against cards that can't actually be destroyed or banished because they're already destroyed or banished.
Okay, and what about discarding cards?
Discarding a card is also sent to the graveyard by default, but it's not required and may be directed elsewhere by some card effects. This means you can activate the effects of danger monsters even if Macrocosmos is in effect. Discarded cards are not considered to have been tributed or destroyed, but they are still considered to be sent to the place they go, by battle, effect, game mechanic, or cost, depending on the situation.
I think I understand it now.
A traditional fusion summon with polymerization also sends the materials to the graveyard by default when the card would resolve. but they're not required to go there when the card resolves. This is why Renoheart get banished when summoned by its own effect but is used as fusion material even though it should go to the bottom of the deck when Havni's resolves.
This is a lot to remember, but at least now I'll catch a few more weird interactions while playing Master Duel. Thanks.
Happy to help.